Well, there's another book that you wrote. Sorry to shift courses so quickly, but called "The Myth of the Rational Voter."
Hmm.
And you're sort of taking on this idea. We talk about how in economics it's kind of common to talk about how people choose what they think is in their best interest, what the highest value for them is. But you argue that this may be true in regard to economics, but it's not necessarily true with in regard to how people vote.
Yeah.
And so why is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I don't just say that it's not necessarily true, which is, well, like say, it's not true. It's not true. The best way of thinking about it is this: you're at the shopping center or you're at the store, you're filling your product with, you're filling your cart with products. And what happens if you fill your cart with products that you don't want? The answer is you pay a pile of money for stuff you don't want and you're not happy. How can you solve this problem? Don't put the stuff you don't want into your cart. Put the stuff you do want into your cart, and then when you pay for it, you get what you want. All right, now imagine you're a voter and you're going and voting for a bunch of different policies. All right. Well, when you check out, what do you get? You don't get what you put into your cart. You get the average of what the other voters put into their cart, and what you put in there is pretty much irrelevant. You can go and vote for all the best stuff in the world and not get it. You could vote for terrible stuff and get it, but it would have happened anyway, right? Imagine that you voted for Hitler in 1933. What did you get? Well, you got Hitler. But was it because you voted for Hitler? No, if you had voted against Hitler, you still would have gotten Hitler. That's the way democracy works. It's totally different from shopping. The way that I like to describe it is, rather than it being like shopping, it's like there's a common pool of water that we all use for two purposes: one, drinking, and two, garbage disposal. So everyone throws all of their filth and trash and waste into this pond. It's also the only place where we get our water. But guess what? If you don't throw your trash in, that doesn't make any noticeable difference in the quality of the water. It still tastes like poison.
Okay, so you also address some economic biases that are common among the
Mhm.
public that economists are far less likely to hold to. What are maybe just a few of those?
I first talk about what I call anti-market bias. It's just a general tendency to have an unduly negative estimate of the social benefits of markets. Basically, it comes down to, you look at markets, you see people are doing it to make money, and then you say it must be bad. All right, which is all wrong. Great line from Adam Smith. It is not from benevolence. The baker bakes his bread from his own regard to his own self-interest. Gives you an idea. Look, the fact that people in markets are trying to make money, which they are, does not mean that they're going to do a bad job. The question is, well, how do you make money? Do you make money by making customers happy? In that case, the fact that you want to make money leads you to treat customers well. On the other hand, do you make money by treating customers badly, which is logically possible? That case is different. I go over just lots of standard cases of how markets work. But then I also go over some weird ones, things like, should you be able to sell your kidney? Most people freak out about this. It's like, why? Well, then a poor person might sell their kidney to a sick person. And that's bad because why? Isn't it good for the poor to get richer and the sick to get better? Why have a system where you can give a kidney away for free, but you can't sell it? It's a very foolish system which causes enormous misery among all the people that cannot get a kidney donation, that just don't have friends and family where there is a match. Another one I talk about is anti-foreign bias. This is where we're especially pessimistic about the social benefits of interacting with foreigners. Obviously, we have things like trying to keep out foreign products, but opposition to immigration is, I think, the very best example, right? Which turns us around to where we started, or brings us back to where we started. People look at a foreigner and they just try to come up with reasons to say no. It's like, look, he's going to come here and grow food. What's the problem? Well, then there's a list of complaints. Right? It's like these complaints are just so trivial compared to the obvious fact that here's a human being who provides a useful service for other people.
Yeah.
What is so bad about that? And why would you want to go and trap labor in low productivity countries like Mexico when they could be doing the same job much more productively in the United States or another richer country?
I was gonna say there's made me think of a Rowan Atkinson sketch where he's playing like a tour, not a tour, yeah, Tory party leader, and he's talking about now on immigration. I happen to like curry, but now that we have the recipe, uh,
Yeah.
but anyway,
Pretty good one. Yeah, I also talk about to make work bias, just a tendency to rate economic prosperity by employment rather than production. Very tempting, but of course, this, if you really took this seriously, you'd want to ban the tractor, right? Mechanization of agriculture reduced agricultural employment, of course. And at the time, if you had just said, well, it's not a big deal, people will find something else to do, people would have called you a dreamer. What else are people going to do? Agriculture has been 95% of all jobs for the last 10,000 years. And the answer is we can find tons of other stuff for human beings to do. It's just we don't figure it out until we actually have the spare resources to do it. Right now, I'm working on another book on government policy where I say we can zoom out to a higher level abstraction and say, really, the unifying principle is this. Markets do the good stuff that sounds bad. Governments do the bad stuff that sounds good. Right? Markets do good stuff that sounds bad, like firing workers that don't do their job, like putting businesses that don't have any customers out of business, like producing stuff that's embarrassing. They make things that people don't want to argue for publicly. They produce alcohol, they produce pornography. What's the argument? People like them. That's the argument. Right? They're embarrassed to admit it, but markets do it anyway because markets go and produce what people actually want, not what they are willing to publicly admit that they want. On the other hand, what do governments do? Governments do the bad stuff that sounds good. Governments do things like, let's keep out hundreds of millions of able-bodied workers who would go and increase the production of mankind because, well, like, this is our country. This is our country. They'll mess up our culture. Like our culture is so great as it is. Right? Or things like, oh no, you couldn't possibly knock down the wonderful historic buildings in San Francisco to build skyscrapers just because it would be worth $1 trillion. Right? Historic buildings, oh, we have to save every single one. Like, who cares about 99% of them? There's a few ones that are great, and market forces will keep them around because people love them. Then we have all of the also-rans, the 2 and 3 stories buildings in San Francisco, which in any world of economic sense would have been bulldozed 50 years ago and replaced with 100-story buildings, of course. But it doesn't sound good. Government does the bad stuff that sounds good, stopping the demolition of low-value historic buildings. Government, like also, anytime someone says, oh, we should like price no object, it doesn't matter what the cost is. Yeah, it matters what the cost is. Of course it does. Doesn't sound good, but government has a strong tendency to spend enormous amounts of money for very little value because it sounds wonderful to ignore cost. But if it was your own money, you would not want to ignore cost.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that dichotomy. That's a
Yep. I
got a
like it
good
too.
ring
That's
to
why I'm doing a whole book on it. It's called Unbeatable: The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets.
I dig it. So, part of I think what you're doing in the Myth of the Rational Voter, and this was written, is it almost 20 years now that it's been written?
Gee, 15.
15. So
don't take away 5 years from me, Cody. I need those years.
Well, so what I'm wondering is, in the book, you argue, you defend the wisdom of economists over laymen on economics, which seems like a reasonable thing to do. But since you wrote the book, there's been a growing antipathy between elites or experts and regular people, and both sides have not necessarily acquitted themselves very well. And going back further in time, you could say, populists start lynch mobs, but elitists also send millions to gulags and they plan economies, poorly, leading to mass starvation. So speaking more generally, there's this question I've been wondering, which is more dangerous to human wisdom and flourishing? Is it populism or is it elitism?
I still say it's populism. Look, elites do some terrible things. Here's the thing. The worst elites are worse than the worst of the populists. But the average elite is better than the average populist. So yeah, essentially, the thing about elites is that they do contain a vastly more extreme range of views. So you can get Bolshevik revolutionaries, you can get your Islamist fundamentalists, but they are not typical elites. They are fringes among the elites. Whereas the populist who just says, let's kick out all the foreigners, cut out, get rid of all the foreign products, I think that actually is pretty much the mainstream of populism. So it's not one where you're not just picking out the worst of the populists. The populists that you hear about are actual typical populists. But if you go and compare just like average elites to average populists, then I think the average elites are better. And in particular, here's the key thing. I think elites fail when they are still too populist. they are good when they stay in their very narrow area of expertise. Like for example, when you talk about elites and COVID fanaticism, look, it is not true that out of all people who are experts on COVID, or even the general view among experts on COVID, is that we should go and do everything possible. That's not what the view was before there was a panic. Before there was a panic, I'd say public health elites had more of a sense of trade-offs. There were even plans of like, how bad do things have to get before we close the schools? And they're like 10 times as bad as COVID actually was part of the plan. But the thing is that when the giant moral panic takes off, then elites start saying things that sound better to normal people, like if it saves one life, that kind of nonsense.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting to think. Yeah, elites are
Yes.
more dangerous when their ideas become more popular, when they become
Yeah.
populist.
Like during a big moral panic that elites generally start saying things that are more stupid and ridiculous, and of course also just start going way beyond their expertise, which
Yeah.
is also a noted problem. Um, so like the economics profession, since I wrote The Myth of the Rational Voter, I think the economics profession has gotten a lot worse.
Hmm.
And in particular, it's just become much more standardly left wing. But I would say it's not that they're standardly left wing on the areas that they specialize in. It's just that they are
Hmm.
much more of just normal left wing people now who happen to also do some econ on the side. It's just not that important. Like the econ is just not that important for their general views. They sort of have a bifurcation where there's these very narrow topics that I actually do research on, and for that, it's not really ideological, but it's also not very important. And then everything else, it's just like, well, what does AOC say about it? So I'll go along with that.
Well, in the book, you talk about how the typical economist at the time was kind of somebody who was sort of center left, somebody
Yes.
who was not really libertarian exactly, but more
Yes. Right.
libertarian economically than the regular person on the
Mm-hmm.
street would be. But they were on all these social issues. At the very least, they tended to be more left wing.
Yes. I
And,
mean,
and
there
my
weren't really many
understanding,
social issues that I talked about, but yeah, but more on economics. So like when I was writing, the data was based upon 1996.
hmm,
But economists then had much more appreciation of the social value of the market mechanism, much more appreciation of interacting with foreigners, much more reasonable views about the long run effects of allowing mechanization to displace workers. And I think that since then, it has become just more stereotypically left wing. There's just
hmm,
been a general loss of interest in standard textbook economics in favor of doing randomized controlled trials on very picky topics. And then for your general worldview, just becoming a regular left wing intellectual, which I think is a big mistake.
I remember seeing some data, and maybe you're more familiar with it than I am, about the amount of academics who were in different fields in their political persuasions.
Yes, yes.
And economics was, I think, one of the most conservative, but conservatives were still rare.
Yeah. So in particular, the best way to do it with academics is to do Democratic Republican ratios, because liberal conservative are to some degree relative to your social group. Like if you are in a sociology department, you might say a moderate, even though compared to the rest of the population are actually very liberal. So
Yeah.
I think the Democratic Republican ratio is sort of like an SAT test where you have a common benchmark and you sort of see where the professors fit in general society. So yeah, so 30 years ago, you would see something like 20 Democrats for a Republican in most social sciences and humanities, but economics would have more like 3 to 1. Now economics is getting to be more like 10 to 1 and probably more like 15 to 1 among younger economists. So we're
Hmm.
converging very rapidly to the monoculture of the rest of academia, unfortunately.